Good morning, everybody. I think people are still filing in to our event this morning. Thank you all for joining us. I know we're all in such very different time zones, and that can be a bit of a challenge with some people being here early in the morning and others quite late in the day. So thank you all for your patience and participation as we work through all of this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that we can maybe have a little bit of visualization of our panelists as we move through. There we go. Fantastic. We have about 250 people registered for this event. People continue to be filing in, but some will join us, of course, for the webinar recorded format later. And others, those of you who are joining us, of course, we have Q&A function, a chat function, and we'll keep monitoring those and make sure that there's time for people to participate at the end of the event. So my name is Nat Hurley. I'm the Associate Director for Intersections of Gender, as well as an Associate Professor in the Department of English and Film Studies. I'm also the Director of Media and Technology Studies here at the University of Alberta. Thank you all for coming to today's event titled Intersectionality, Qualitative and Quantitative Research Design. So this is the second event in a series of 4 under the title of Encountering Expertise in Intersectional Health. We've been developing this between the Intersections of Gender signature area at the University of Alberta and the Women's and Children's Health Research Institute. So across the 4 sessions we planned in this series, and we hope you'll join us for the later ones too, panelists from the health sciences, social sciences, and humanities come together to provide introductory, theoretical, methodological, applied, and even grant-oriented information about how health research and researchers do, can, and should use an intersectional lens for more dynamic, informative, and impactful research. Before I introduce our panelists formally, I also want to recognize the conditions of possibility for our work here at the University of Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the lands of the Métis Nation Region 4. No doubt you all are joining in from different other territories with different other relationships to your Indigenous colleagues and communities. We work and live here on the traditional lands of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other Indigenous communities. Like all our institutions, the U of A continues to be shaped by the forces of colonialism to the benefit primarily of white settlers. In this context, I consider myself an implicated subject who recognizes that the work of being in good relation to Indigenous colleagues, communities, and staff members and students is very much ongoing. So we're here today to talk about intersectionality, qualitative and quantitative research design. And it's in the context the context we bring to this conversation is one in which intersectional theory has been used by health service researchers to bring to light how intersecting systems of oppression contribute to health experience. Despite this, and it's a pretty dominant and widespread theoretical model, there is actually still limited understanding of how to do this work, how to conduct intersectionality research. So this is why we have this session today, which we offer in collaboration not only with WICRI, but with the Worldwide Universities Network Intersectional Research Group that funds some of this work we're doing. And we hope to discuss key considerations in incorporating intersectionality into qualitative and quantitative research design, including on women's and children's health. We have 3 wonderful panelists joining us today from various locations in the globe. I'm going to introduce everybody. They will all speak for about 20 minutes. And I will turn things over to them as soon as I'm done speaking, but I'm going to give you a little bit of information about them from the outset, and then they will present in the order that I will introduce them right now. Joya Mishra is Professor of Sociology and Public Policy and Director of the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Massachusetts. For almost 3 decades, her research has focused on intersectionality by race, gender, class, parenthood status, and nationality in workplaces, higher education, and at the societal level using both quantitative and qualitative methods. Daniel Holman is a lecturer in sociology and public health at the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield, where he co-leads the Well-Being and Health Across the Life course research theme. He's also a research fellow for the university's Healthy Lifespan Institute, and he was principal director for the ESRC-funded project Chronic Disease and Healthy Aging at the Intersections, Social Locations, Biomarkers, and Health Practices. Dr. Holman's research focuses on health inequalities, social determinants of health, intersectionality, and the life course. And Tim Houts is research leader at the Research Center for Education and the Labor Market, ROA, at Maastricht University School of Business and Economics. As of April 2021, he also holds a part-time position as professor of sociology at the Center for Global Health Inequalities Research, CHAIN, in Norway. In his research, he examines how national and institutional factors influence social inequalities and how these factors moderate the impact of education and employment on outcomes such as health and well-being. His work has appeared in a broad range of journals in sociology, demography, and public health, although probably democracy is important too. Additionally, together with international colleagues, he designed the rotating model on social inequalities in health and their determinants for the 7th wave of the European Social Survey in 2014, and that will be repeated for the 11th wave in 2022. His research has also been awarded with the Philip Leverhulme Prize in 2017 for outstanding achievement. So we have a pretty esteemed group of panelists joining us today. We're so delighted that you're all here. I'm going to stop talking because you didn't come to hear me talk about this stuff. You've come to hear talk about these wonderful speakers that we've lined up for you today. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Misra to share her screen with us and to take over letting us know more about what she's up to.
Which screen do you see?
We're seeing the one that includes your notes right now.
Better?
There you go.
All right.
Perfect.
So I'm really grateful to be here today. I want to thank Nicola and Nat for including us and including me in this panel with Tim and Daniel, and for the great work of Rachel Zukowiski and Tanya Voth organizing. I think that this is a really wonderful opportunity, and I'm happy to be talking about some of my work that I've done with my collaborators, Celeste Currington and Venus Green. I really also want to note that at my institution, I am learning and teaching and living on or near the ancestral homelands of the Pecumtuck and Menominee people, close to the Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Mohegan, Pequot, Mohican, and Abenaki. So I acknowledge my institution's role in histories of dispossession, but I also recognize my own responsibility to my Indigenous connections with this land. As I was getting online, 10 of my slides disappeared. So I'm going to basically walk you through the first 10 slides of my talk, and then I'm just going to move into just talking with you. So intersectional theory, I think all of us know, explores how gender intersects with many other statuses and structures to affect our opportunities and experiences. It requires us to understand how gender combines with race, class, sexuality, gender identity, and other statuses in specific geographic and historical contexts to create a very particular set of opportunities and constraints. So rather than understanding these different statuses and structures as separable pop beads, or additive kinds of approaches, we really kind of say, oh no, all of this has to come together. Our methodological practices are conduits or vehicles for intersectional theorizing, as Pat Hill Collins says. The reasoning and the logic that characterize intersectionality as an analytical framework inform how we conduct our research. And I think that too often methodology is hidden behind this kind of cloak of neutrality. And instead, my collaborators and I really argue for thinking explicitly about how methodological choices allow us to develop intersectional insights. So I'm going to walk us through a number of methodological tenets that should be central to do intersectional research, as well as some of the misunderstandings about intersectionality. And those misunderstandings are really what keep many people from engaging fully with intersectional research traditions. So I really want to clarify this. As a methodologist who uses qualitative, historical, and quantitative methods, and I've trained a lot of people using many different methods, my goal in this talk is to make everyone feel confident that you can do it, that this is all feasible. The first tenet recognizes that oppression and power is core to intersectional thinking. This is really central to the insights of women of color, especially Black women who first theorized intersectionality. And it's really kind of the center of what we do. Jennifer Chun and her colleagues critique misunderstandings that suggest that intersectionality is allowing for crafting a kind of personal design or identity based on the complexities and contradictions of individual biographies. Instead, our true goal is revealing that power works in uneven and differentiated ways. So intersectional scholars are thinking about how oppression shapes the human experience. Pat Hill Collins talks about placing this into a matrix of domination. So, like all of these things are kind of playing out: structural practices and policies, disciplinary processes that rely on bureaucratic hierarchies and surveillances, hegemonic ideologies, as well as interpersonal discriminatory practices in everyday lived experiences. So this matrix of domination, it's not neutral, it reflects this kind of notion of oppression. We also think a lot about relationality, and that also can get lost in intersectional, or as people are trying to do intersectional work. So the oppression for some group is interconnected with the opportunity or the privilege for others. So categories of difference are interconnected, but privilege also can function to make other categories invisible. So that helps us understand how, like, a universal category of womanhood made Black women's oppression invisible within a white feminist movement. A misunderstanding of intersectionality is that these social constructed dimensions of difference determine their experience, but they're not interlinked. So we have different experiences, but they're not related. And we're arguing, nope, they are related. So here, like the older white man ordering food, they don't just have a different experience than the young Black man working in the restaurant. They're linked. Their privileges that accrue to the white older man are directly linked to the Black younger man's disadvantage and oppression. So, for example, the low pay that the young man receives makes fast food cheap enough for the older man to rely upon, right? So these things are always linked. We also emphasize that social inequality is complex. It would be easier to just think about one category, say social class, but inequality always reflects many different socially constructed dimensions of difference. And this kind of illustrates an underlying theory of knowledge that contrasts with Western epistemology that tries to organize the world into binaries: men versus women, Black versus white, gay versus straight, the West versus the rest. So recognizing complexity instead means that we have to be thinking about how seemingly distinct categories are linked, interactive, and relational. And I especially like the way Ivy Ken talks about this as how flour, sugar, eggs, and butter come together differently depending on the measurements, how long, what shape they're baked, right? All of these things can make many different things. Rather than trying to pull this apart and say, okay, well, what is flour doing here? We have to think about how they intermingle to create particular outcomes. And an additive misunderstanding of this is to think, oh, okay, well, these things are always, important. So these certain privileges always are more important than others. So for example, while Black straight men have privileges that are linked to the disadvantages that Black lesbians experience, it's really imperative to understand that in some context, a wealthy married Black lesbian may have greater privilege than poor single Black straight man. So we think in a much more complex way, I would say, when we do intersectionality. We also really identify the specific contexts in which privilege and disadvantage play out. So adolescent misconduct in schools reflects not only intersections of race and ethnicity and gender, but also whether it's a rural or an urban or a suburban setting, and the social control mechanisms that exist at the school. If we, rather than thinking about socially constructed dimensions of difference as variables that are competing with each other to explain the variance in a quantitative model, what we're doing is thinking about how these different sets of overlapping conditions matter the most. So we're really interested in the contingent nature of intersecting statuses. And this really kind of challenges the notion that we have like kind of independent variables that can be analyzed in isolation that are fixed rather than contingent and relational. And a misunderstanding here is that these socially constructed dimensions of difference are fixed in a hierarchy that never changes. Race, class, gender, they're contextual, they constantly change as the economy changes, as politics shifts, as there are new ideological processes. So there isn't a unified or experienced one experience of inequality. We face oppression in ways that reflect variations of power and privilege, and where the salience of race, class, gender, and other statuses vary according to time and space and place. So we carry out intersectional research in ways that are really cognizant about how this is intersecting in different spaces. These are two different pictures, one of Detroit and another of Beverly Hills, and what's happening differs based on those contexts. We also rely on a comparative logic that's common to social research more broadly. We compare outcomes for diverse groups. So for example, we might look at the difference, as Kayla Prieto-Hodge does, of Black women and Black men who are police officers, but we also can compare subgroups. So Dawn Dow looks at Black mothers and thinks about the different strategies that mothers take for mothering Black children in a racist society. A misunderstanding about the comparative nature of intersectional research is the implication that we have to incorporate variation on all potentially socially constructed dimensions of difference in our sample and in our analysis. So we have to look at all of the intersections of race and gender and class and educational attainment and relationship status, parenthood, sexuality, gender identity, nationality, ability, but that isn't feasible. So for example, in her intersectional analysis of family, Collins argues, while I allude to class, ethnicity, sexuality, and age in the following discussion, I place greater emphasis on how family links social hierarchies of gender, race, and nation. So she thinks about the intersections that are most salient for the particular argument she's trying to make, leveraging the insights of intersectionality, but not like trying to do everything. And I think that that's really important, that we always need to be thinking about, based on our research question, what's the intersection that matters most? What's most salient? We can't cover all the bases, but we can design our work creatively to think about how simple additive categories don't really uncover things, and think about what are the most salient statuses for our research questions, recognizing that if we looked at other socially constructed dimensions of difference, we might have different insights. That's okay. That's okay. We can't do it all at all times. And finally, all of these factors contribute to what some intersectional scholars do, which is deconstruct categories, call into question simple notions of categories themselves. We critique the integrity of categorical distinctions, and say, if we uncritically use categories of difference like race and gender, we might intentionally essentialize differences between groups. So for example, the heteropatriarchal state creates rewards and penalties that aren't simply and categorically gendered, but routinely imposed on bodies based on notion of gender conformity and non-conformity. We want to be really attentive to, there's a lot of malleability here. We want to kind of think about how partial and fluid socially constructed categories are, and how they're often, part of oppression. A misunderstanding here is that deconstructing categories releases them of meaning. So they're all kind of, it's just cultural relativism, right? Like there's no inequality, there's just a lot of differences. It doesn't matter because these things are not real. And as Thomas and Thomas argue, if people define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. So I would argue that deconstructing categories, highlighting their instability, gives us greater traction in explaining inequality. It doesn't say inequality doesn't exist because this is all socially constructed. So overall, I'm, kind of arguing there's this wide array of approaches to intersectional research: qualitative, comparative, quantitative. I'm going to leave further discussion of quantitative methods to the other speakers, but I want to emphasize that I've seen intersectional work carried out using regression models, using decompositions, using sequence analysis, using structural equations. There's not a quantitative method that can't be used. And in fact, there's no one right way. We should have a lot of different blueprints that show how different methods can be used effectively to investigate intersections. So now I'm going to talk through a few studies that I think are really useful in thinking about qualitative studies and thinking about how to do this well. As I said, my slides just suddenly got cut off. So I had a bunch of slides with some beautiful pictures of these works, but I'm just going to kind of walk you through. I'm going to tell you about them and let you see how different people have done this. So for example, Ragini Malhotra did a beautiful piece of work that looks at the way that childhood is criminalized among unhoused children in New Delhi. So here what she does is she kind of thinks about oppression and power, the ways in which these children face a wide array of inequality in their daily lives. She thinks about kind of the relationality of this. So she thinks a little bit about how these children are linked to those who are, kind of the state bureaucrats. So people running the homeless shelter, the teachers, the healthcare workers, the police. And she's also kind of showing the complexity here, the ways in which these different identities, class and caste and migration status and gender and, ethnicity are all playing out among these unhoused kids. She's also very attentive to context. So she looks, for example, at one homeless shelter, and she looks at an unauthorized housing settlement. And she's able to kind of think about, well, how are these processes playing out differently in these different contexts? And interestingly, there's actually a little more autonomy in the unhoused settlement, although bulldozers may come down and just knock it all, down any day. She also thinks a lot about sort of comparison. So she's looking at, kind of differences by these different groups. And she's kind of deconstructing notions of childhood, right? So she's showing, for example, how young boys, if they try to go into the school because they want to learn and because they're so interested in having opportunities, the teachers will kind of chase them out and call them names and say they don't belong there, right? She kind of shows how childhood in this setting becomes criminalized because of the lack of support and because of the oppression that exists there. Celeste Currington did also a beautiful ethnographic work in Portugal, in Lisbon, Portugal, looking at Cape Verdean workers who come to do elder care. And in her work, so it's really an interesting setting because in Portugal, these home care workers that are coming from Cape Verde, they have some, colonial relationship with Portugal. So they're able to kind of move there. They're able to bring their families with them. Yet they can't really take care of their families because they're doing this care work that kind of keeps them out of their own homes and taking care of other folks. And again, like the white Portuguese folks that they take care of kind of benefit from that care work, even as their own families kind of lose their care work. And interestingly, the white Portuguese workers who work in the same for the same agencies that provide home care, they don't have to do the dirtiest work. It's left for the Cape Verdean workers. There's a lot of complexity in the way that she thinks about this. She follows the workers through their day, so she follows them all through the different homes that they go into. She shows the variation in the different contexts of different homes. She does comparisons. She thinks about people who have, citizenship and people who don't. She thinks about people with dark skin and those with lighter skin. She thinks about, many different ways, educational status. Some people have college degrees, but the only job they can get is in home care because opportunities are so limited for Cape Verdean workers in Lisbon. And then she also does some deconstruction, right? She kind of shows this malleability in the category of home care worker and migrant. Let's see, another study by Katie Acosta. Sure, it's totally fine to share the references. I think that we shared even the papers that link to this, sorry. Katie Acosta does this beautiful work looking at the families of sexually non-conforming Latinas. And she's trying to kind of understand what is going on as they are in contact and connecting with their families of origin and, trying to kind of work through their relationships in their current families. And here again, she shows a lot of oppression. She shows a lot of, challenge that sexually non-conforming Latinas face, within their families. She shows the relationality of how there are, these very interlinked experiences for those who are not sexually non-conforming and those that are. She also shows a lot of complexity and does a lot of comparisons because she looks at things like, how people's legal status impacts their relationships, how people's race or the race of their partner impacts the way the family responds. So for example, there can be a lot of anti-Black racism among Latinos who view themselves as not Black. And so she plays all of that out. She thinks about the context, the spaces in which all of this works. And she really kind of deconstructs the idea of what it means to be sexually nonconforming, right? Like she deepens our understandings of sexuality by thinking through how these processes work in this particular group and in relationship with families. I also really love the work of Elaine Bell Kaplan, who has this book called We Live in the Shadow. It's a beautiful piece of participatory action research. So she does photo voice with a bunch of 12 and 13-year-old, I think it's maybe 12, 13, 14, and 15-year-old kids. And she also does work with teachers and other kinds of people who are doing supervisory work and police, I think, in their neighborhoods, as well as some parents. And here she's really trying to kind of show how here we have a group of children. They live in South Central Los Angeles. They're living in kind of what people refer to as inner city environments with very, few opportunities. And the kids take pictures of their neighborhood. They take pictures of their schools. They take pictures in their homes, and then they analyze them and they interpret them. And we really hear the voices of the children because this is a participatory method. And here we're able to see the way that oppression and power and inequality play out in the lives of these children, the ways in which they really face oppression from so many different directions, the relationality of it, right? Like why it is that these children are kind of written off, and how it's not just kind of like the structural impediments that they face, but they also face a lack of relationships. They face lack of relationships with teachers, with social workers, with police officers, like all the people who could be helping them are kind of like turning their backs. She shows a lot of complexity. We hear from a lot of different voices that, really allow us to understand that there are many different strategies here and many different experiences that differ by gender, that differ by race, that differ by class and, even education. And she really gives us a beautiful sense of the context. The pictures really provide a lot there in terms of our context. And then she deconstructs, she gives us this opportunity to understand that these children who are being written off, we have their own words that tell us how much they want opportunities for mobility. And yet they are not given those, those chances. They are kind of treated as if they don't belong. The last thing I was going to talk about was Anna Branch has a beautiful book called Opportunity Denied, where she works through historically from 1860 to 2010, the different opportunities for Black women, Black men, and white men, understanding their occupations and how they've shifted over that long time period, but how oppression is always related, how relationality always shows that Black women are in the worst jobs, how context matters in terms of what part of the country, what time, 1860 is different from 1960, making these comparisons and deconstructing the notion of, kind of opportunity. The book is called Opportunity Denied. All right, so that's my talk, given that I lost my slides. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Joya. And next up is Daniel.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, can you see that okay?
Looks great. I've got you spotlighted too, so it's just you and your screen. Take it away.
Brilliant. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. It's a great honor, and I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to be talking about quantitative approaches to intersectionality. And it was reassuring to hear Joya's talk there, because many of the things that she talked about in terms of some of those key principles and misunderstandings, I also cover as well, I guess, from a sort of practical perspective in terms of how you actually implement the policies of intersectionality in quantitative research. So I'm going to talk about 4 different topics. So first, the topic of heterogeneity, about defining the intersections that you're going to study in quantitative work. I'm looking at interaction effects. Then I'm going to talk about a method that's called MIDA. I'll talk about the full name of that and explain it more when we come to it. And then look at some potential future directions. Okay, so for me then, intersectionality has 2 essential ingredients when you're doing quantitative work. So the first of those is heterogeneity. So we're interested in comparing intersections, however they're defined, in terms of some outcome. On the left there, you can see intersections defined, for example, by ethnicity, class, and gender identity. And then the second essential element that Joya talked about as well is a focus on social power and systems of discrimination in particular. Obviously, we see this in Crenshaw's original work, looking at heterogeneity in terms of the combined effects of gender and race, but also the theoretical basis of that work in anti-racist feminist scholarship. Understanding those systems of discrimination and oppression that lead to those intersectional differences. And of course, intersectionality involves many different ingredients, such as those that Joya has discussed already, but without a focus on heterogeneity and social power, I think that you don't have intersectional research. So these are the 2 ingredients I'm going to be focusing on in my talk. Okay, so heterogeneity then. So one of the first things that we need to decide when we're studying intersectionality is how we're going to define the intersections under study. And I think one of the key questions here is how we're going to work with that heterogeneity and how we're going to define it, how complex we're going to go, which variables we're going to look at and how we're going to categorize them, etc. And there's also the question of whether all of the intersections we look at are of equal interest. I think it's important to say from the offset that the purpose of intersectionality is not to define more and more risky subgroups, to have a very sort of granular perspective where we've got tiny intersections that might have particularly high or low levels of an outcome, but instead to take some key points into consideration really when we're thinking about defining the intersections. So we need to think about the main axes of inequality in relation to the subject of study. So for example, we know that in mental health, there are strong gender, ethnicity and socioeconomic inequalities. We know that immigration and language are important in terms of accessing healthcare, and that age is important when we think about access to employment. Along with other variables as well, of course. So when we think about these types of inequality in our study, this needs to be informed by what's already known. So informed by existing theory and existing quantitative and qualitative research. So we're not just picking these types of inequality out of the air, we're basing it on what's already known. And importantly, I think we also need to think about the sort of policy, intervention, social justice implications of the way that we define the intersections, because of course, intersectionality is a theory of social change, a theory of social justice. And we need to question whether the level of heterogeneity we're working with can help to achieve these ultimate sort of aims. There's a risk on both sides, I think, that if we're not complex enough, we risk missing people who fall through the cracks, to use Crenshaw's term. But if we're too complex, we end up just with a very sort of granular picture with many, many different intersections that's completely sort of unfeasible to work with. And it also is, you know, is not going to inform policies or interventions, because policymakers tend to like simplicity. And then we also need to think, of course, about sample size and what's practical. So ultimately, we're limited by sample size and the data sets we're working with. We can, you know, use larger data sets, for example, use administrative data or big data. But then we run into the issue that the analyses might not be practical because we just have too many intersections to analyze and make sense of. So we can end up in the weeds, so to speak. So we can think of this like a continuum of intersectionality, and on the left, we can conceive of just one homogeneous population, no consideration of inequality at all. And of course, in this situation, there's no social grouping because there's no inequality. On the right-hand side of the continuum, we can conceptualize infinite diversity. So we just reach the conclusion that everyone is infinitely different from everyone else. They're a unique combination of social categories, and therefore, in effect, everyone just occupies their own intersection. But what's really interesting about this is that you end up at the same conclusion as you do on the left and right-hand side, because you have no social group in there either, because you've gone so far that everyone is just different. So this is, I guess, more akin to the sort of anti-categorical approach to intersectionality, which typically uses qualitative methods, which is a valuable approach and you know, is well implemented. You know, focusing on people's unique circumstances, situations, life histories, etc. But it's not, you know, we can't use it for quantitative research because we avoid categorizing people. So what we want ideally is somewhere in the middle of this continuum. So we want to categorize in a way that highlights diversity and inequalities, but we also want to do this in a way that's actionable through policy. And like I said, based on existing theory and research and of course, data limitations. Okay, so once we've defined our intersections then, we need to think about how we're going to analyze the differences between them and indeed within them as well, which I'll talk about soon. And as Julia mentioned, there's many different statistical methods to do this. You can use interaction terms, dummy variables, main effects, multi-level models, structural equation modeling, so on and so forth. So there's many, many different methods. Obviously, I can't cover all of them today, but what I will focus on is interaction terms and the MIDA approach. And I'm doing this because interaction terms are a very common way of quantitatively analyzing intersectionality. They're widely applicable across a range of methods. Whereas the MIDA approach is something of a development of using interaction terms, and it takes them, I think, in a new direction. And it's also the method that my group have been focusing on. So the first thing that is vital to say is that when we're analyzing intersectionality quantitatively, we must allow for potential interaction. And this is an example from a Boleg and Bauer paper where they look at a paper by Schulman et al. In '99. And in the left-hand panel there, they didn't specify interaction terms, which they should have, because there was an interaction in the data. And you see that in the right-hand panel. And obviously the differences between the groups are very different in those two scenarios. So the situation on the right is correct, on the left is incorrect. And so if we don't allow for a statistical interaction, we can end up in trouble and with misleading analyses. So using interaction terms to analyze intersectionality, as I said, well established, easy to implement, but a few sort of key limitations. And one of these is that it's very tricky to interpret interaction terms when you're working with complex analyses. So when you start including 3, 4, or 5-way interactions, it's very difficult to interpret what's going on with the model and make sense of it. It looks a mess, essentially. And this also means that you have small cell sizes for some of those intersections and the models don't run properly. And there's also the statistical issue that when you test many different intersections, 5% of them are going to appear significant just by chance, because we tend to use that level of significance testing in quantitative research, or the opposite, it won't be significant when it actually is. So one partial solution to these limitations is the multi-level analysis of individual heterogeneity and discriminatory accuracy. It's a bit of a mouthful, shortened to MIDA. And just to give credit to the origins of this, so illustrated first by Claire Evans, 2018, elaborated by Merlot and termed MIDA in the follow-up commentary. We've tested the method as an improvement on using interaction terms, and it's recently been shown by Greta Bauer's research group to perform well statistically in comparison to other methods for both continuous and binary outcomes. But just to say, there is some debate still around how you actually interpret these models. And I'll cover some of those issues as I describe it. Okay, so in a conventional multi-level model then, typically we would look at something like country differences in health. So we can tell whether health varies more within or between countries. And so in this model, if we have an ICC value of 10%, then we know that 10% of the variation is due to country differences, but 90% of the variation is due to individual differences. So we can determine the effects of countries on health essentially as a kind of contextual higher level variable. With the MIDA method, we do something similar, but now instead of the level 2 variable being countries or schools or neighborhoods or whatever that might be, it's now the intersections. And so what we can tell with this model is whether health varies more within or between intersections. So this shows self-rated health and intersections defined by gender, ethnicity, and education. And for example, in this model, if we have an ICC of 6.7%, then 6.7% of the variation in health is due to this kind of intersectional clustering. So it's due to the intersectional category that you belong to, essentially. But most of that variation is actually, and that should be 93.3, is actually due to intersectional differences, individual differences in this particular example. And the other thing that we can do with this method is to look at multiplicative effects as well. So this graph shows how much multiplicative or synergistic variation there is in health for these different intersections. So this is health that can't be explained simply by adding together a person's individual attributes. It's something that's more than the sum of its parts, so to speak. And in this example, the ICC is about 1%. So 1% of the variation in health is due to multiplicative effects. I think it's fair to say that we're still trying to work out what we do with this information and what it tells us from a policy and intervention perspective. One idea might be to look at how much synergistic intersectionality there is in different policy contexts, in different countries, for example, in different neighborhoods. And we can also look at, for example, different outcomes, and there might be different levels of multiplicativity for different outcomes as well. This might tell us, for example, whether we need to design single or multi-component interventions that target multiple axes of inequality at the same time to, for example, reduce inequalities in health. But I think what's more important actually from an inequalities perspective is what the differences actually are, which are driven by both the layering of disadvantage, but also some multiplicativity as well. So in this example, for example, we see that the worst health is for Pakistani men and women with low levels of education, and the best self-rated health is for white and Chinese men and women with medium or high education. Okay, so a word of warning with this approach is around the idea of the tyranny of the averages. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that we're only looking at kind of mean differences between these intersections. And there's significant variation within each of these. And so essentially the intersection doesn't define the person. So Merlo shows this really nicely in his 2018 paper. And gives two examples. So in A and B here, the mean level of the outcome is the difference between the mean for intersections blue and red is the same. But in the first example, there's very little overlap between those intersections. And in the second example, there's lots and lots of overlap. So in scenario A, if we know someone's intersection, we've got a really good idea of what their level of health is. In scenario B, we know on average what the level of health is, but there's lots and lots of overlap within that. So this example has low discriminatory accuracy. And this is important because if we think about designing policies and interventions, we can actually be inefficient if we have low discriminatory accuracy, because we're assuming someone's level of a particular outcome, where actually that intersection does a poor job of telling their health. We just know the overall mean for that intersection. And so we can end up sort of inadvertently stigmatizing people by assuming these characteristics. I think this is an open question. I think this shows how important this measure of discriminatory accuracy is. It might be that different types of outcomes have different levels of discriminatory accuracy. So for the other type of discrimination, social discrimination, it might be that the intersections do a really good job of differentiating people. And similarly in terms of things like access to resources or housing, labour market outcomes, and other types of variables. This model is mainly being employed in health research, so there's lots of opportunities to employ it in different contexts. And lastly, it's important to note that at the population level, even a small shift in the mean level for an intersection can be meaningful and produce a meaningful effect across the whole of the population. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about some potential future directions and the idea of analytic intersectionality. So what I've been talking about is descriptive intersectionality, so describing those inequalities in granular detail. But actually we also need analytic approaches, so approaches that allow us to think of the causes of these inequalities and possible intervention strategies. So for example, whether discrimination mediates the association between intersectionality and health outcomes. Multi-level models that allow us to include contextual factors, such as different policy environments in different countries, for example, or different local neighborhood or school environments. Causal inference approaches. So I think this would be particularly powerful, for example, in being able to show that the introduction of a certain social policy had uneven intersectional effects. And of course, lots to be said for mixed methods approaches, which again, I think are hugely underexplored in intersectionality. So, these are able to, I guess, address some of those other key elements of intersectionality and some of those key principles around inclusion, empowerment, co-production, etc. And so we could think of interesting qualitative methods and mixed methods designs where we use those methods to inform how we define the intersections, and we interpret the findings going back to those qualitative groups, focus groups, for example. And it'd be interesting to compare the kind of the within and between heterogeneity that we see using interviews and focus groups. And lastly, I think there's lots of scope to introduce a life course framework. We know that inequalities are not static. They occur across the life course from birth into older age. We know that those dynamics are really important in terms of how their effects echo across the life course. And so I think there's lots of scope to think about the, what happens when you bring these two frameworks together. And that was the suggested reading for this talk. So thinking about, for example, at what age inequalities emerge, and the key life transitions that exacerbate them, and the lifelong consequences. And also, I think importantly, this is a good way to bring in the role of institutions, because of course we pass through different institutions as we age. For example, we transition to employment or into pension age. So lots of exciting and interesting future directions for quantitative methods and intersectionality. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Certainly exciting indeed. That's exactly what I would say. Lots for us to discuss. And before we get to the actual discussion, though, I'm going to turn things over to Tim to take over the screen for a bit, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nat. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. So in my presentation, I will focus on intersectionality in health research, share some methodological insights on this. And of course, while doing that, I will partly overlap a little bit with the two earlier talks, because I think Joya and Daniel have really given great introductions already to qualitative and quantitative methods. So I think part of what I will say will sound familiar after what you've just heard, but I think what I'll try to do is, well, on the one hand, start maybe a bit more from a health inequalities perspective, just to kind of situate the research a bit in that line of work, and also to perhaps bridge the two presentations that you've heard so far. I think in some ways, I can really see how we can connect some of the work that we've heard about there. So I'll start with a brief background about health inequalities research. From there, I will talk about the complexity of health inequalities and how intersectional perspectives could actually be important to address this complexity. Then I will talk about the context. So how can we bring in the social, political, and institutional context, which is something that, that Daniel and Joya have also talked about already. I will say a bit about methodological applications, but I will not talk that much about the methods as such, because, well, those have been covered particularly by Daniel, because my work is also mostly quantitative in nature. So I don't want to duplicate too much of what he has already said, but I want to try to link this to some theoretical work and see how this could inform further development of the methods. And I will also conclude with some directions for future work and some reflections based on, well, where are we now with this line of research? So looking at the state of the art so far, what have we achieved already as a research community, and what should we be aiming for in future work? I added this slide about me just for introduction, but Nat has already introduced me at the start. So I don't want to really say too much about this, but there were two things I wanted to highlight, one of which I already mentioned. So my research is mostly quantitative. I have done some qualitative work and some more critical work as well. But most of it is quantitative. So that's the main kind of expertise that I'm talking from here. Also, for me, while doing research on intersectionality, it feels important to me to acknowledge that I'm doing this work from a position of privilege. And to me, that is really, something I want to acknowledge when I talk about this, but also something I want to be conscious of when I do this work. So, starting from health inequalities research. So this is what got me started as a researcher. This is what I did my PhD in, and what I'm still mostly working on. So I think it's clear that there are considerable inequalities in health based on all kinds of factors. And the figure shown here is a figure that was made by Dahlgren and Whitehead in the early 90s. There's been a lot of criticism of it, rightly so, but I think it still kind of gives a good visual introduction in this line of thinking about health inequality. So it is influenced by a variety of factors, some that are a bit closer to individuals, well, as they are in their home environments, in their family environments, and some at a bit higher level, more structural, cultural, environmental, economic conditions, which do also influence them directly. And because of this, people's health varies strongly between social groups. So for example, based on educational level, based on gender, based on race or migration background. And these health inequalities are shaped throughout the life course, as Daniel just also mentioned. So they are shaped in various stages of the life course, in various ways, and this happens in different ways for different people and different groups of people. And this reflects the embodiment of social inequalities more generally. So health inequalities involve the embodiment of the social circumstance, social stratification systems that people are part of. There's been a lot of work on this, a lot of research over the past few decades, particularly, and this large body of work has informed policies as well for tackling health inequalities in various countries. So for example, in the UK, there was a particularly strong strategy for trying to tackle health inequalities explicitly. However, most of this research has focused on single dimensions of inequality in health. And with that, I mean that research focusing on the link between gender and health inequalities, mostly focused on gender, without also looking at the role of education or socioeconomic status or class, or race and migration. At least when you look at this larger body of work, focusing particularly on health inequalities, it was quite siloed, where different lines of work developed in parallel. And this is problematic because people embody multiple stratification systems simultaneously. So we have multiple identities, we have multiple categories that we belong to, and the context that we live in are characterized by multiple systems of stratification. So one example of this is, for example, looking at the role of racism in Europe. It still informs institutional and everyday discrimination in societies, which affects newcomers and ex-colonial citizens still. And because of this, we should not ignore looking at migration backgrounds or ethnicity when we're looking at, for example, socioeconomic inequalities in health or class inequalities in health. So from the perspective of doing justice to complexity, it is important to look at multiple forms of inequality, multiple forms of stratification simultaneously. So together with a few colleagues, we published an article about this in Social Science and Medicine. I believe this was also made available before today's meeting, in which we make a case for how intersectional perspectives might help with this. So how intersectionality could help to do more justice to this complexity, particularly looking at health inequalities. So this could also be applied to other fields, but our focus was mainly health inequalities research. Also taking this starting point of this whole body of research on health inequalities that doesn't really acknowledge these linkages between multiple forms of inequality and stratification. So I'll talk a little bit more about this paper in a minute, but one of the papers that kind of flowed from this research agenda was a more applied paper focusing on quantitative research, which was done also together with one of these colleagues, with Anna Gioleka, who was a PhD student I worked with in York when I was still based there. And here we looked at migration-related health inequalities in Europe, and exploring the roles of generation, occupational status, and gender. So I'm not going to say too much about the methods, because actually these methods are very similar to the interaction methods that Daniel just described. And when I was preparing this presentation, of course, I was thinking, oh, let's think what Daniel might cover already, talking about quantitative methods. So I already imagined that he would cover the methods as such in detail. So I didn't want to do that again. So I just summarized our approach here, and just explained a few key findings from this work. So we used quantitative approach, looking at 27 European countries, using interaction models and computing predicted probabilities. So predicted probabilities of being in poor health, and we looked at a few indicators of poor health. And what we found is that this intersectionality informed perspective really helped. It was really promising. So we found that migration-related health inequalities in Europe vary according to gender, occupational status, generation, and also vary according to the exact health outcome, which is also important to realize, given that a lot of quantitative work is limited by, well, the limited set of health indicators that data sets usually contain. So it is important to really be conscious and critical of which health outcomes are used exactly and what that might imply. So another interesting thing was that health inequalities between second-generation migrants and other groups were wider for women with lower socioeconomic status. So this was one of these findings that highlighted that it is important to try to do justice to this complexity, to these intersections. They are important when you think of health inequalities as well. Now, one thing that was a bit problematic in the paper that I've just discussed is that we didn't really bring the context in. So we pretty much treated gender and migration, status and generation as individual attributes of people. And I think what was really clear from the two previous presentations is that that is really, well, a quite limited view on social categories, and also quite limited view on what intersectionality really involves, because it is not just about individual attributes, it is very much also about power structures of the context in which people are embedded, and about the social, political, and institutional factors that play in these contexts. So how can we do that? How can we bring in this interplay, which Yuval Davis has labeled situated intersectionality? How can we do justice to the fact that individuals, as members of groups, may share common positions within those groups, but still their individual experiences of this membership may vary? So there are a few ways in which this can be done. And the past few years, a lot of this work has started to take off. So again, the focus here is mostly on quantitative work, because that is, yeah, what I'm most familiar with from my line of work. But one way of doing this is by the use of multi-level methods that Dan has also just discussed. So he already covered the MIDA methods, which I've mentioned here. And yeah, it's funny to see that the two names I wanted to list here were also the first two on Daniel's list. So Claire Evans and Juan Merlot. They've really done pioneering work in developing these methods, but now more and more people, such as people in Daniel's team, are also working with this, which I think I agree with Daniel here. It's a very promising method, but yeah, we need to think carefully about what we can actually do with the results that we obtain from this line of work. But in principle, the idea, I think, to me, the most important point here is that by using these multi-level methods, we can find a way to do more justice to the structural nature of these inequalities, even in a quantitative approach, where quantitative approaches have been criticized rightly for focusing way too much on the individuals And I think these kinds of methods allow us to integrate quantitative methods with much more explicit attention for structural factors, and allow us to really do justice to people being embedded in these social, political, and institutional contexts. Another way that we can do justice to the importance of context is related to the use of these models, these multi-level models. And this is really specifying social categories as both individual and structural. So this is something I think Daniel touched upon in his directions and next steps at the end. But I think there are some really good examples of work that have started to do this. So specifically related to health inequalities, of course, there has been a lot of work on structural racism in the past few years, also structural sexism. But I think when it comes to the application to health inequalities and really trying to bring this in quantitative work, I particularly like the work of Tyson Brown and Patricia Homan, who've really done really interesting work where they try to connect the individual experience to the structural context when it comes to, for example, racism. So what's next? So I also want to end with some reflections. So there's been a sharp increase of research on intersectionality and health inequalities over the past few years. And there are a few main directions there. So on the one hand, it's about the integration of institutional factors. So work that really acknowledges that the structural context is also reflected in how stratification is embodied. And I think it is really important for quantitative work to also really work on situating individuals within those structural contexts and within the circumstances that they're experiencing. There's the adaptation of new developments and methods. So there's the MIDA models that I mentioned already. There's also causal models. So Daniel also just touched on that, but I think, for example, John Jackson, who I think is now based at Johns Hopkins University, has really done some interesting work there on working with mediation models and moderation models. And well, you know, we could easily cover a whole hour just working through these kinds of methods such. So this is really just a taste of the kind of work that is going on in these directions. But for those of you who are interested, I've just mentioned these names. I didn't include specific references because each of these people have published multiple papers in the past few years that are really relevant here. Finally, the life course perspective, where I think that Daniel Homan really is one of the leading figures in developing these methods. And it's really exciting to see where this work is going. And because health inequalities really do develop across the life course, it is really important that this is acknowledged as well. Also relating to what Joya mentioned, we should really also be conscious of changes. The social categories that people belong to are not stable. They change over time, and they also change between contexts. And for this, also a life course perspective is really promising to try to deal with these differences over time and between different spaces. So there are also some challenges. So there are promising directions, but there are also some challenges. So far, a lot of the work has focused on the US, more recently also on the UK, for example, Daniel's work, in Sweden. So Juan Merlot has done a lot of work now in Sweden, but not much beyond that. And I think it's important, especially given the context dependency of these intersections and how relevant they are for health inequalities. It is important that we try to examine multiple contexts and try to also to compare to some extent, but also just to learn from single contexts and to see which intersections are important there. This relates to my next point, which is about the need to analyze multiple institutions that are relevant for the emergence and maintenance of health inequalities. But here I completely agree with both Joya and Daniel, it is not about trying to map out all possible combinations. It is about trying to have an informed approach towards which particular institutions or intersecting institutions might be important for particular intersections of social categories. And this is challenging, but here theory development is really a promising way of approaching this. And I think there have been examples already of where this has been presented in papers. Right. There's some methodological challenges. So can we do justice, methodologically speaking, in quantitative work to people being embedded in multiple institutional contexts? Well, actually, there's at least one paper by Tyson Brown and Patricia Homan and Brittany King, published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior last year, which does exactly that, and has really made some interesting steps forward there in trying to work with multiple institutions and see how these together cause structural intersecting inequalities. And in a way, what they've done is built on the research agenda that we published in 2018. And I think this really shows potential for next steps as well. And then there's the changes in institutional context over the life course. So here we are making progress, but it is a challenge to also think of how to integrate changing institutions. So institutions change. I think, as we are seeing every day, people's rights can never be taken for granted, wherever we are. And in terms of integrating this in methodological work, this also offers challenges for us. Finally, just echoing also the previous speakers, we could really use more integration of qualitative and quantitative work. It has been quite siloed in my experience in this particular line of research, thinking of intersectionality and health inequalities. I think we can really benefit from some mixed methods work and also perhaps from more generally more creative work of learning from each other. Finally, I just wanted to conclude with this quote, which is from the paper that we published in 2018, because to me it really expresses the delicate balance between looking at the context and looking at the individual. So it's useful to think about this kind of balance as a theoretical tool, but it's also challenging. So it's not just about explaining how institutions shape individual experiences, but rather really the interaction between the two. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What a rich conversation this already is. I'm so grateful to everybody. And I think we're already getting some responses and questions. I invite the panelists perhaps to turn on your cameras again. It is also possible for any of our participants or attendees, if they would like to voice their own question, I can unmute you, allow you to speak. I don't think we can get you to present in terms of your camera, but we certainly would welcome any voices into the conversation, either through the chat or the Q&A. We do have one question live in the Q&A, which I will just read out for everybody's benefit. We're gonna have a second one, so I'm gonna work our way through and allow the panelists to comment. From Michelle Hebert, thank you, Tim. There are different perspectives on the value of theory development. Would it be all right to further discuss your thoughts on theory development? Why important and what to mitigate when working in this realm? And Tim may have some things to say, but maybe Joya and Daniel would like to weigh in there too, and we'll let this question kind of move through the panel before we move to Sarah.
Yeah, sure. So perhaps I can start. So thank you for this question. I do think it would be great to also hear the thoughts of Joya and Daniel about this, given that they've also talked about this. I think that the main value of theory development here is to get more of an informed sense of where we would expect intersections to be particularly meaningful and particularly, well, harmful, you could say, when it comes to health inequalities. and to particularly also think of how this relates to the context that people live in, and thinking of context in terms of the social context, the political context, the institutional context. So why, for example, would you expect that in the one society or in one community, particular groups of people would experience particularly strong benefits from their situation, while in other contexts, those same groups of people or people with the same characteristics would not. And I think Joya gave a few very good examples of exactly that in her talk. So it is very much context dependent, and I think the theory development is really needed to get a grasp on what distinguishes contexts. So in what ways are they meaningfully different for these specific intersecting groups or specific intersecting categories?
Thank you, Tim. I don't know, Daniel, if you or Joya would like to weigh in here as well on that question.
It's a brilliant question, and Tim gave a good answer already. I think using theory to understand why there are intersectional effects is really important. I think that also it's useful to think of what the different social categories mean when we're looking at intersectional effects. So, following sort of Yuval Davis's work on how different social categories have sort of different ontological bases. So we can think of, different sort of processes and mechanisms, boundaries for those different social categories, and then what they actually mean when we combine them with others. That's theoretically really challenging, but I think it's important to try and unpick some of that, because otherwise we just end up with a situation where we have lots of intersections, lots of differences, but yeah, so what? What's going into making those differences? And I think theory, using that to understand those mechanisms and processes, I think that's absolutely central.
Thank you. Joya, would you like to weigh in?
I just agree. And I think, in my field, there was kind of an emphasis on the theory with a little bit of which meant that people were not really sure on the method. So I've been kind of like following through and trying to make this, okay, well, but let's think through what the theory suggests about how we do these things. But there's I think one of the sample papers that I put up there was a paper in this Gender Reckonings book that is really all about gender theory and how a quantitative sociologist like myself can be also a deconstructionist.
Well, that's fascinating, of course. I mean, and Sarah has a question here, but it does seem to me also to open up some opportunities for collaborating with humanists, right? And who kind of work more fully in the realm of that kind of the philosophical conceptual frameworks, and that these things are all very much speaking to each other, especially when you use a term like deconstruction and category. We've been talking about category instability in the face of the data analysis and the quantitative analysis. So this seems really exciting to kind of be able to pull some of these threads together. I want to turn now to Sarah Doro's question here in the Q&A, for those of you who wish to read it. And Sarah says, thank you so much to the panel, very stimulating. A question for basically any or all of you. Crenshaw and other scholars have pointed to an overemphasis on domination in research that takes up intersectionality. Intersectionality is also about the transformative possibilities and practices at the intersections of statuses, relations of power, which I know we've just been talking about. What does it look like to actively build interest in the transformative possibilities or agencies of intersectional positions and spaces into method and methodology, beyond aiming for outcomes that influence equitable policy, et cetera, et cetera? So I wonder if anybody would like to jump in on this question as well.
Well, I'll just say that I think that participatory action methods are really excellent for this, like really helping communities kind of articulate for themselves, like how they want to think through how they're how they are agents and how they are resisting and how they are engaging. And I do think that in my context of the US, the Black Lives Matter movement has been like this really beautiful version of this, right? This movement kind of led by Black and queer women, really kind of creating a rethinking and a re-understanding of possibilities. And, you know, I'm seeing movements around Black joy that are having like a really pretty profound reorientation of what it is we're looking for. So I absolutely think that methods can be used to tap into this. You know, the field I'm coming from, sociology, it really is all about analyzing inequality and oppression. But I don't think that that's all there is for intersectional methods.
Great. Others, Daniel, Tim, anyone?
Yes, I'd agree with that. So I think like co-produced research is a really sort of valuable tool here. So involving, you know, people from the beginning, this idea of, you know, nothing about us without us kind of thing, feeding into all steps of the research design. But I also think there tends to be something of a deficit model. So, you know, there's the idea that we look at the most disadvantaged intersections and the ways in which they're disadvantaged, but actually, you know, if we think about sort of strength, resilience, agency, ownership, all those sorts of things, they're powerful tools as well. So I think moving away from that deficit model is always a valuable thing to do. And I think co-produced research is a good way to do that, to begin to do that.
Mm-hmm. Tim?
Yeah, just very briefly, I fully agree. I just wanted to add that in the Netherlands at the moment, research on health inequalities very, very strongly focuses on involving people, as Daniel said, from the start in every phase of the research, also in defining the aims of studies that we conduct, defining the research questions that we study. And this is, well, in the Netherlands, this is quite a recent development, and I'm very, very positive about it, because I think that's what we need to really address the questions that need to be addressed and to phrase the questions that need to be phrased.
Mm-hmm. I'm struck as well in your responses and also throughout the talks about the ways in which the research has the potential to, I think, not allow the dominant groups to go as unmarked. I mean, I think especially, Daniel, in your charts where you kind of have whiteness as a category that is an intersectional category. And it's not somehow we have this abstraction or kind of general category of the human. And this seems also to somehow not allow us simply to just do easy social reproduction modeling as well, and to kind of put all the things on the table that allow us to imagine that all of those things are subject to change. And it's not just a kind of an attention to the most socially disadvantaged groups or health outcome disadvantaged groups. It seems like a very exciting way to kind of think about transformation as something that is driven in all sectors, or kind of that all these social categories can be subject to change. So super exciting. I'm going to move into the chat where there are also now a couple of questions, first of which is from Brianna Palmer, who asks, how might you present the idea and need of intersectional analysis to colonialist institutions that may be hesitant or resistant to adopting? Maybe another way also of asking how we might indigenize and decolonize intersectional analysis too. So this seems to be a very complicated question. Anyone?
I just think that the relationality to this is kind of the reason why we find all of the resistance that we do. And, you know, I just think that, you know, it would be lovely if we could like attend to intersectional inequalities and, you know, kind of really take them in and use them to restructure our world and decolonize our world. Without people feeling like somehow those people who have been in power and those people who have had privileges, you know, aren't losing anything. But, you know, the truth is that like what appears to be natural for those of us with privileges are, you know, is completely unnatural, is completely based on, you know, as a set of processes that are disadvantaging many groups of people. And so I do think like my own practice is very much, aimed at transformation and reworking institutions. And I come up against resistance in every level. And it's almost always based on not wanting to give up privilege, which feels natural to those groups, right? So I think, like I'm thinking about this a lot about academia because I've been spending a lot of time trying to work through the pandemic impacts on the academy. And, there's just so many, it's very clear the things that we need to do to create kind of more equitable universities. It is very frightening for people to think about making those kinds of changes because it feels like the ground beneath them is being shifted. So, I mean, I don't know that I've been successful at getting people to understand, but I definitely feel like I'm in many more conversations with people who buy it and are willing to kind of work toward the goal.
Our questioner follows up here, says, for example, might it look like a mandated quota system? We have seen on the news, for example, how there is definitely a need for it, but how might it be enforced or implemented? This is still part. I know I skipped over another question, but I thought this was relevant to the conversation. Tim or Daniel, I don't know if you'd like to kind of add anything here to what Joy has already said or respond to the follow-up from the questioner.
Yeah, I wouldn't really know how to respond to the follow-up question, so perhaps Joya or Dan can jump in there, but maybe just to follow up on what Joya said already. Yeah, I very much recognize the issue of privilege, and I think this also links to what Daniel already said about the deficit model. I think one challenge that we have here is that too easily we tend to discuss this in terms of disadvantage. We talk about intersectionality in terms of disadvantage, and I think it's really very important that it becomes very clear that this is as much about privilege as it is about disadvantage. When we think about power, both are important. And when it comes to the political reality of this, we really need to drive home that message. And sometimes also, we need to do that despite, the focus on complexity. And I think that is another element where we need to bring the message of complexity in simple terms sometimes for political purposes. And that is really, really difficult. And one useful exercise that I did last year was that I was invited by someone to write a blog explaining to basically just whoever what intersectionality is about and why it's important. And that was, just from my own experience, that helped. And I think it also helped in being able to communicate to others what it is really about and why it is really important and why it is also not just about disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does seem that some of the questions here are about resource allocation and the historical context or conditions under which our data emerges as such, right? So that there's a long history of resource allocation and colonial kind of resource extraction, whether that is through human resources or, energy resources, land, that sort of thing. And then it brings us back to the question of how we think about the taking of responsibility and the question of historical redress. I mean, again, I have my hat as a humanist on here that suggests, some of these things also require an approach to that is historical, that is conceptual, that kind of tries to somehow explain how things got to be this way and not just how we make sense of the snapshot of the present in these ways that are also complex. And Daniel, I realize I maybe kind of jumped in too quickly without giving you a chance to say what you might want to say here too.
No, that's fine. So I think the idea of ring fencing, the positions in universities, for example, I think that's a good intervention. So we already do that in the UK sometimes for PhD positions. Starting to think about doing it for other types of positions. I mean, this is one one small intervention that, you know, is positive that must be seen in the context of something much wider, I think, which is about the you know, what you just mentioned. So addressing some of those historical injustices and roots to where we are today. So, you know, that might be one intervention, but there's many others that we need to think about, I think.
Okay, I'm conscious that we have precisely 1 minute left, and I just want to read out the remaining 2 responses we have from within the chat and the Q&A, and give our speakers one last chance to either respond or add any final comments. So from the chat, and this is mainly to Daniel, but anybody else, with respect to studies or results, you mentioned if approximately 10% of difference is due to intersectional differences and approximately 90% is due to individual differences, does that suggest that perhaps the categories need to be defined in greater detail? You mentioned that policymakers like simplicity, but what if overly simple policies just don't work? Impact assessment of policies, effective use of public funds, how do policymakers or the way in which policies are implemented influence the way in which research in this field is conducted? Wow, and then sorry, yeah. Daniel, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you, carry on.
I was just going to put the other one on, but you go ahead and answer this one, given that it's directed to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is fascinating. This is a topic of like a paper or two. I think there's a lot in there that's, you know, for me is really exciting stuff to think about this, because you know, it's the theme that we've been talking about. What do you do with the complexity? You know, with the complexity is important, but how do you get that into policy? And I think policymakers do like simplicity. So if you go to a policymaker and say, look, we looked at 100 intersections, here's the effects, what policies can we have there? Well, we can't, you know, so it's really, really difficult to think about this stuff. I think the idea of introducing more and more categories, I think potentially if they're axes of inequality, if they're intersectional categories, but there's always a danger there of, you know, you fall into the trap of, okay, this is about defining more and more risky subgroups, and then you lose the wood for the trees, and you get more towards the right side of that diagram where everyone's just more and more different, essentially. So you lose the things that bind us, you know. So there's lots and lots of balancing acts to make. These points are really good and interesting. That, you know, and we need to think about funding, policy making, the balance of categories and all this stuff at the same time. So it's an enormous challenge, but an important one.
Yes, and the gap between the activity of doing the research and the activity of communicating its kind of so what question back to those policymakers, and that maybe these are kind of separate, complicated tasks.
Absolutely.
Our last Q&A, the question in the Q&A from Salima Alana is about sample size. Are there specific methods to determine sample size for quantitative intersectionality-based research? If we have 3 or 4 intersections that we're looking at, especially because we're trying to have an adequate cell size for each group we're looking at, I assume we would need a large sample size, but maybe this is something the panelists could weigh in quickly on before we wrap up.
Is this in the Q&A part?
It is. Oh, I just, I moved it to the answer because we were moving to the live, but it's in the bottom. Salima Alana, if you can read it.
Sorry, I don't know if you can jump in, Tim, because I didn't quite catch it.
I've been using kind of a very simplistic kind of rubric in my own head. So generally, if I have any cell size that's less than 50, I stop. Nope, I'm not gonna try to make too many arguments based on that. So then if I think that through, then I'm able to kind of think through, okay, well, what is the sample size I'm really looking for, and how am I going to oversample certain groups in order to get the variation that I need? And you know, I mean, it all depends on the data set you have.
And that's clearly a challenge for any quantitative data set, right, that we look at. This is not unique to intersectionality when we try to think about what is the relationship between the extent of data we collect and the conclusions we can draw from it. Tim, I see you nodding here. I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think this very much applies to any quantitative data. And I think here it feels maybe a bit more sensitive because it does come down to the decision of which axes of inequality or which intersections you're willing to include. And sometimes it's a bit of a kind of a borderline case where you would say, well, there's 45 cases in one cell, right? So what am I going to do? Am I going to drop this whole axis of inequality or this whole social category just because it's a bit under? You know, it's a delicate balance that you have to achieve. So I'm always a bit hesitant to really work with strict rules of thumb, but I can see Joya's point. Yeah, you do need to kind of guard your your lower limit, that it doesn't fall through too much.
And of course, sometimes one spreadsheet is the source of a new research project. When you see the spread of data and discussion, that you realize that you need to kind of revamp or take a new tack or direction in what you're doing, because those skews sometimes are as interesting as the spread.
Yeah.
I wish we could stay here all day and talk about this. People have already started to leave, understandably. We're past our time a little bit, but this has been such an enormously rich conversation. Thank you all so much for sharing your work. I know that this is going to kind of plant 1,000 flowers for all of us to see blooming in the field of intersectionality research design. And I want to thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. I see a lot of thanks flooding in here in the chat. If anybody wants to look in, very thought-provoking and interesting. And I want to remind you that the recording of this event will become available as soon as we can do the editing and that sort of thing. So many people, I think, will come back and have a look at this much later. And I know I also want to say thanks on behalf of the Director of Intersections of Gender, Dr. Bukola Salami, who had hoped to be able to deliver some concluding remarks herself, but her kids are sick today, so she's really trying to kind of balance a whole lot of things today, even though she's signed in here. And I just wanted to say some thanks on her behalf, on behalf of Intersections of Gender, and on behalf of WICRI. Thank you again to Tanya Voth and to Rachel Zakuski-Pezem, to our esteemed panelists. And it's been just such a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for coming and joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for hosting us. Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure.